If you remember British roads before the Continentals took over, you remember an ERF, the hand-finished Cheshire lorry that hauled the nation's fuel and bricks and toffee up every motorway. Its Gardner diesel burbling in a way that, for a certain generation, is the sound of British haulage. At its peak, ERF employed 1,400 at Sandbach and took a tenth of the British heavy truck market, the last great independent lorry maker in the country. It was born in the depths of the 1930s slump. It survived the Second World War. It survived a recession that cut its output from 16 lorries a day to 16 a week. It survived every wave of European competition that killed its rivals one by one. And then, after nearly 70 years of making, the last British ERF left the line and the name was gone. How does a firm that survived all that, the slump, the war, the giants, vanish from its own hometown? What happened inside those books? Chapter 1. 2 works, 1 town. There is a town in Cheshire that once did something no other town in Britain managed. It built the lorries that built the country, not from one factory but from 2, standing at opposite ends of the same small market town, run by 2 branches of the same family, who for the better part of a century regarded each other as rivals. The town is Sandbach. The 2 names were Foden and ERF, and if you drove the length of the M6 at any point between the 1950s and the 1990s, you shared the road with their work. The tanker hauling fuel, the tipper heavy with aggregate, the Arctic thundering north past the service station that still bears the town's name. Some of those lorries were built a few miles from where you were driving, by men who lived in the terraced streets you couldn't see from the motorway. ERF was never a giant. That is the first thing to understand about it. It didn't cast its own engines or forge its own axles. As the judge who would one day preside over its ruin put it, plainly and without cruelty, ERF didn't produce its own components. It assembled trucks from parts bought in, at home and abroad. The chassis was its own. The cab was its own. But the heart of the thing, the engine, came from Gardner down the road in Patricroft, or later from Cummins. The gearbox came from David Brown, then from America. The axles came from Kirkstall. What ERF did was choose. It picked the best of everything the world could offer, and it bolted it together with a care that turned a parts list into something hauliers loved. That was the whole philosophy. A small firm, buying brilliantly, building bespoke. The last great independent lorry maker in Britain. It was founded by a man named Edwin Richard Foden, and the story of how he came to build trucks a mile from his own family's factory is a story we'll come to. It endured for 70 years. It survived the slump that killed its birth decade. It survived a world war. It survived a recession in the early 80s that cut it to the bone. It survived every wave of foreign competition that swept away its rivals, one by one. And then it didn't. Here is the thing that makes this story different from the ordinary tale of a British firm outmuscled by bigger foreign ones. ERF was not, in the end, destroyed by a better German lorry or a cheaper Swedish one. It was destroyed by its own accounts. By the time the German giant man came to buy the company in the last months of the old century, ERF was already living on a secret, a lie inside its own books so large that the men negotiating the sale did not know it was there. One of the people in those rooms was a quiet, unqualified accountant named Stephen Ellis. Remember the name. We will come back to him, because his is the saddest part of all of this, and the least like the story you might expect. For now, hold 2 pictures in your mind. The first is a town that made lorries at both ends of its high street, where the works hooter meant a wage packet and a way of life. The second is a hole in a balance sheet, roughly £100 million deep, dug quietly over years by a single man who, the court would later accept, never took a penny of it for himself. Between those 2 pictures lies everything. So let's begin where it began, not with the lie, but with the man who walked out of his family's firm and built a rival from almost nothing. Chapter 2. 3 men and a boy. The Fodens had been building things that moved for a very long time before ERF existed. The family engineering business at Elworth, on the edge of Sandbach, went back to 1856. By the turn of the century, Edwin Foden, the elder Edwin, had made the firm's name synonymous with the steam wagon, the great snorting road-going engine that hauled Britain's goods before the internal combustion lorry took over. In 1901, the War Office ran trials to find the best military transport wagon, and the Foden steam wagon was widely felt to be the moral victor, even though it was placed second to a Thornycroft. That was the Foden reputation. Engineering that impressed the men who knew, built by a family that had turned a Cheshire village into a centre of heavy manufacturing. But steam was dying, and the death of steam is where the family split. Here the story forks, and it's worth walking down both paths, because the official version and the local historian's version disagree in ways that change the whole colour of the founding. The official version, the one the family and the company told for decades, is a story of vision. Edwin Richard Foden, Dennis's father, the younger Edwin, known as ER, saw that the future belonged to the diesel engine. He wanted the family firm to abandon steam and embrace the oil engine, and a board still wedded to boilers and superheaters wouldn't have it. So in 1932, at an age when most men are thinking of retirement, he left. Pushed out or walked out, depending on who's telling it. A diesel prophet rejected by his own kin. The local historian Alan Littlemore tells almost the opposite story. In his account, Edwin was no diesel visionary at all. He was a brilliant steam engineer who wanted to keep steam alive, a man who still had plans for higher pressure boilers and superheaters, still convinced the road engine had life in it. It was the Foden board, Littlemore argues, that ordered Edwin in 1931 to design a truck around a Gardner diesel, not the other way round. And the reason he ended up leaving had less to do with engineering conviction than with family arithmetic. He was effectively forced out by his majority shareholder stepmother, and it was his son Dennis, who, as Littlemore dryly puts it, could not afford to resign, who drove the new venture forward. Both versions end in the same place. In 1933, at the bottom of the Great Depression, when insurers would barely underwrite a steam boiler and the country had no spare money for anyone, Edwin Richard Foden and his son Dennis set about building a diesel lorry of their own. They did it in a lean-to conservatory at a house called Hillary House, with the lights burning through the night. Edwin was 63 years old. When the first chassis rolled out, they gave it the number 63, his age. It became known ever after as ERF number 1, and it survives to this day, cherished in the hands of the people who keep the marque's memory alive. They were not alone in that conservatory. Ernest Sherratt, an engineer who'd come across from Foden, did the drawing and the design. George Faulkner ran the works. The cab was built by a Sandbach coach builder, John Henry Jennings, whose firm would clothe ERF lorries for years to come. And there was Dennis, the son, the one who could not afford to walk away. Sherratt remembered later that the rivals across town scoffed at the whole enterprise. What can they do? The doubters said. Just 3 men and a boy. 3 men and a boy. It became the founding legend, and like all good founding legends, it was both true and a little too neat. The venture was first styled E.R. Foden and Son Diesel, but there were already Fodens making lorries in Sandbach, and the confusion was intolerable to the older firm. So they took Edwin's initials, E.R.F., and the company became ERF. 3 letters. A man's name reduced to its bones, stamped on a radiator, ready to be argued over by hauliers for the next 70 years. The first ERF was shown at the Commercial Motor Show at Olympia in 1933. Under the bonnet was a Gardner, the 4-cylinder 4LW, the engine that would define the firm's early character. Economical, unburstable, beloved by any operator who counted the pennies, which in 1933 was every operator alive. From the very first day, ERF was an assembler. Gardner engine, David Brown gearbox, Kirkstall axles, a Jennings cab. The philosophy arrived fully formed, in a conservatory, by lamplight. The early models came quickly. The CI4 with its Gardner 4, then the CI5 and CI6. In 1935, ERF built its first 6-wheeler to order, for a customer whose product tells you everything about the modest, practical world these lorries served. It was built to haul Hall's toffee. 2 years later came a twin-steering 6-wheeler, the configuration the trade nicknamed the Chinese 6. By the end of the decade, a firm that had started as 3 men and a boy in a conservatory had built more than 400 lorries. Edwin lived to see it become something real. He died in 1950, at the age of 80. A steam man, or a diesel man, depending on whose story you believe, but either way the founder of a company that carried his initials onto the roads of the world. Chapter 3. The Best of British. The war made ERF in the way that the Second World War made or broke so many British engineering firms. The company built for the Royal Army Service Corps, turning out lorries for a country that suddenly needed everything at once. But the war also taught ERF the vulnerability that lived at the heart of the assembler's model. When the government requisitioned Gardner diesels for other war work, ERF found itself a lorry maker without its defining engine. It adapted, as it would always adapt, and fitted the AEC 7.7-litre engine instead, in the models it called the DI series. The firm learned early that when you don't make your own heart, someone else can stop it beating. It was a lesson that would return, decades later, in a far crueler form. After the war came the confidence. In 1948, ERF launched its V-type, and the firm began to look less like a wartime supplier and more like a maker with ideas of its own. The ideas belonged, in large part, to Ernest Sherratt, still there, still drawing, and to the coach builders at Jennings. And then, in 1954, ERF did something genuinely daring. It built a beautiful lorry. The KV cab, the letters stood for clear view, spelled with the cheerful disregard for orthography that the era loved, was a styling landmark. It had a curved wraparound windscreen, made from triplex glass bent into a shape that gave the glassmakers headaches and gave the driver a view that no rival could match. It was designed with a young man at Jennings named Gerald Broadbent working alongside Sherratt, and it looked like nothing else on the road. Sherratt caught the spirit of it years afterwards. They were being adventurous, he said, doing things no one had done before. That was the thing about ERF in these years, a tiny firm at the edge of a Cheshire town, and yet willing to take a risk on a curved windscreen that a bigger, more cautious company would never have countenanced. The KV was proof that small could mean bold, rather than timid. 1954 was a pivotal year for another reason, and a sadder one. Edwin had died in 1950, and death duties threatened to break the family's hold on the firm. To meet them, ERF went public. The company that 3 men and a boy had built by lamplight now had shareholders. It was the right decision, perhaps the only decision, but it was the first loosening of the family's grip on the thing they'd made, a grip that would hold just for another 42 years, and then let go entirely. Running the firm now was Dennis Foden, the son who could not afford to resign, who had taken the company public. But Dennis died young, around 1960, and control passed to a man who would become the face of ERF for a generation. Peter Foden, made a director at the age of 20 in 1950, and now, still a young man, the head of the family firm. Under Peter Foden, ERF kept innovating in the quiet, practical way that suited it. In 1962 came the LV cab, and with it a genuine British first, fail-safe spring brakes, brakes that applied themselves if the air pressure failed, rather than releasing and letting a laden lorry run free. It was the kind of advance that never made a headline, but saved lives on the A roads, and it was typical of ERF, not glamour, but the sort of engineering a working driver could trust with his life, because he was trusting it with his life every single day. In 1964 came a 32-ton prime mover with the American Road Ranger transmission, a lorry built for the new motorway age, for the long hauls that the M roads were beginning to make possible. And in 1970 came the A-Series, with power steering as standard, another small mercy for the men who wrestled these machines around Britain's roundabouts and dock gates. That same year, 1970, ERF tried to grow by buying a rival. The old Lancashire maker Atkinson was up for grabs, and ERF bid for it. It lost. Seddon took Atkinson instead, to form Seddon-Atkinson. But ERF gained something from the failure that mattered more than the acquisition would have. In the churn of a takeover battle, engineers move, and one of the men who came to ERF around this period was Jack Cook, an engineer out of the Atkinson world, who would prove central to the single most important thing ERF ever built. Because ERF was about to make the leap that would define it. Not a curved windscreen this time. Something that would let a company of a few hundred workers stand toe-to-toe with the giants of Europe for another 30 years, and something that the Germans, at the very end, would take one look at and throw away. Chapter 4. The Plastic Fantastic. Imagine walking onto the erecting shop floor at the Sunworks in Sandbach in the mid-1970s. The sound reaches you first, the ring of spanners, the hiss of air tools, the low constant hum of a factory that never quite falls silent, and the smell. Machine oil and hot metal, and underneath it something sharper and stranger, the resinous tang of molded plastic curing under heat. That smell was the future, and ERF had patented it. In 1974, ERF launched the B Series, and with it, the innovation that would carry the firm for the rest of its independent life, the SP cab. The letters stood for steel plastic, and the idea was quietly revolutionary. Underneath was a steel cage, a skeleton strong enough to protect the driver in a rollover. Over it went panels of something called SMC, sheet-molded compound, a glass fiber-reinforced plastic pressed into shape under heat and enormous pressure, at temperatures around 130 to 140 degrees. The man who pressed those panels for ERF was named Harry Knight, managing director of ERF Plastics, and the process he oversaw gave the little firm advantages that money alone couldn't buy the giants. The panels didn't rust. On a British lorry, sprayed with road salt through every long winter, corrosion was the enemy that ate a cab from the inside out, and ERF's cab simply didn't rot. The panels were light, which meant more payload, and when a panel was damaged, you didn't cut and weld and fill and repaint. You unbolted it and bolted on a new one, often at the roadside. Best of all, the steel cage made the SP the first British cab to meet the tough new ECE 29 rollover safety standard. A firm of a few hundred people in Cheshire had built a safer cab than manufacturers 100 times its size, and ERF had patented the system, which meant the giants couldn't simply copy it. This was the genius of the assembler taken to its height. ERF bought the best engines, Gardner still, but now increasingly the powerful American Cummins, and the Rolls-Royce Eagle for those who wanted it. It bought Fuller and Eaton, gearboxes and Rockwell and Kirkstall axles, and then it wrapped the whole rationalized, carefully chosen driveline. The arrangement it called CP for common parts, built around the popular Cummins, Eaton and Rockwell combination, inside a cab that no one else could match for safety, weight or repairability. The engineer Jack Cook, brought in from the Atkinson battle, was at the heart of the SP cab's development. It was, more than any single thing, the reason a tiny company survived among titans. The people who built these lorries were not abstractions. They were Sandbach and Middlewich people, and the works knew them by name. When ERF opened its service centre at Middlewich in 1971, a building engineered, with grim local practicality, to withstand the ground subsidence caused by the brine pumping that had honeycombed the Cheshire Plain for generations, it filled with characters. The company diary from those years remembers them. Dave Roberts on the floor, a storeman called John Smith, Reg Holland in export packing, crating lorries for the far side of the world, Ray Scragg in the export department. There was a robin that famously nested in the parts stores, and the men left it be. These are small details. They are also the whole point. This was a place where a bird could nest in the stores, and everyone knew about it. At the top of it all was Peter Foden, and he ran the firm in a way that belonged to an older world already passing. He walked the production line and greeted the workers. He was known to climb into his Bentley and drive to a customer's yard simply to have a cup of tea and talk lorries. The gaffer knew the men, and the men knew the gaffer, and the customers knew both. It was not an efficient way to run a modern manufacturing business. It was, however, exactly why hauliers stayed loyal for decades. By the end of the 1970s, that loyalty and that engineering had carried ERF to its productive peak. At the Sunworks, the firm was building up to 4,000 chassis a year, 16 lorries a day. About 1,400 people drew a wage from ERF, and the packing cases in the export shed were stenciled for destinations that told you how far a Cheshire lorry could travel, including, in large letters, the firm's single biggest overseas market, ERF South Africa. 16 lorries a day, from 3 men and a boy. Hold that number. We will need it later when the counting runs the other way. Chapter 5. The King of the Sandbach Road. To understand what ERF meant, you have to understand what it meant to be loyal to a lorry. British hauliers in the Golden Age were not shopping for transport the way a fleet buyer today shops for transport. They were buying an allegiance, and ERF, along with its crosstown cousin Foden, commanded a devotion that the accountants of a later era would find almost impossible to value, because it didn't show up cleanly on any balance sheet. The judge who tried the case at the end put it carefully. The brand commanded a high degree of loyalty among customers, many of whom also liked to buy trucks made in Britain. Made in Britain. For a certain kind of operator, that was not a slogan, but a principle. ERF understood this, and from 1978, it built a whole marketing identity around it. the Trailblazer, the best of buying British campaign, an appeal aimed straight at the heart of the man who wanted his fleet to carry a British name up the British motorway. And they came. Beresford Transport of Tunstall ran ERFs. Frank Tucker of Exeter, trading as Westbrick, ran them for decades. Bassett's ran them. Century ran them. These were not household names to the wider public, but in the world of haulage they were institutions, and their transport managers went on record, again and again, about why they bought British and why they bought ERF. Loyalty like that is earned one breakdown avoided at a time, one roadside panel swap at a time, one cup of tea with Peter Foden at a time. The lorries went far beyond Britain. South Africa was the great export market, its packing cases stencilled and crated at Middlewich. In Australia, ERFs were sold badged as Western Star, a small, almost invisible detail in the 1970s that would take on an enormous and terrible significance decades later, when the same name Western Star came back into ERF's story as its owner and ultimately as the defendant in the largest commercial fraud action of its day. Africa took ERFs for mining. The Middle East took them. There were bus and coach chassis, the Trailblazer and the Super Trailblazer built for African routes. There were fire appliances, bodied by Jennings, the same coach builders who'd clothed ERF No. 1. For the town, ERF and Foden together were simply the identity of the place. For almost a century, Sandbach was home to two truck makers, and a boy growing up there might have a father at one end of town and an uncle at the other, and a fierce, friendly argument about which firm's lorries were better could last a lifetime and never be settled. There is a detail that captures the pride of it. ERF operators on the continent were known to recover a broken-down ERF themselves, rather than trust it to a foreign agent. The loyalty ran both ways, the operator protecting the lorry's good name as fiercely as the maker did. That is not a rational commercial relationship. That is something closer to faith. But faith has a weakness, and it was already visible in the Golden Age, even if no one wanted to look at it directly. The buy-British loyalty that was ERF's great strength was also, slowly, a shrinking niche. Across the North Sea, the Swedes and the Dutch and the Germans were building lorries that offered the driver something ERF's tough, economical, practical machines did not. Comfort, refinement, a cab that felt like a place a man might want to spend 12 hours of his life. Volvo, Scania, DAF, Mercedes. Their trucks had driver appeal, and driver appeal was becoming the thing that sold lorries, because drivers were becoming harder to find and harder to keep. ERF built the gaffer's truck. The lorry the owner chose because it was economical and British and repairable. But the day was coming when the driver, not the gaffer, would choose. And on that day, the loyalty that had built Sandbach would start, quietly, to drain away. For now, though, at the turn of the 1980s, and again as the decade turned once more, ERF stood as high as it had ever stood, and it was about to build the finest lorry it would ever make, and mark, without knowing it, the end of its independence.
Chapter 6. Diamond Jubilee. Numbers are treacherous friends to a firm like ERF, and it's worth being careful with them. ERF was never a major manufacturer in the sense that the European giants were major, but it punched, and there was one year when the punch landed clean.
By the end of 1988, ERF had registered 3,740 trucks in the United Kingdom and taken 10% of the market for lorries above 16 tons. 10%. For a firm of a few hundred people, buying its engines from other men, that was a genuine high water mark, the moment when the little Cheshire assembler held a full tenth of the heavy end of its home market. It was the peak of the E-Series era, the reward for the SP cab and the buy British loyalty and the decades of quiet, practical engineering. And then, for its 60th anniversary, its Diamond Jubilee, ERF set out to build a lorry worthy of the occasion. The EC series was launched in May 1993. It had taken 4 years and around £14 million to develop, an enormous sum for a company ERF's size, very nearly a bet of the whole firm on a single new range. And it was, by any measure, a fine thing. A steel skeleton clad in recyclable composite panels, the SP philosophy matured and modernised. Cummins Power, or the Rolls-Royce Eagle, built by Perkins, a cab that could finally compete with the Europeans on the terms that now mattered. The EC was the last all-new truck that ERF designed and built as an independent family firm. Everything the company knew, everything it had learned since that conservatory in 1933, went into it. It was a Diamond Jubilee present from the firm to itself, and to the hauliers, who'd stayed loyal for 60 years. Stand at that summit for a moment, because the view is about to change. Here is ERF in the early 1990s, seen from outside. A profitable firm, just about. The last great independent British lorry maker, still in the hands of the founding family, still run by Peter Foden, who still knew the men on the floor. A firm that had just spent a fortune it could barely afford on a beautiful new lorry, betting on its own future. A survivor of the slump, of the war, of the brutal recession, of 40 years of foreign competition that had killed almost everyone else. And here is ERF seen from a little closer, with the knowledge of what was coming. A small firm, thinly capitalized, its buy British market slowly shrinking as the drivers won the argument the gaffers used to win. A firm whose great strength, that it bought its engines from Cummins rather than making its own, was a dependency it did not fully understand yet. A firm about to pass, after more than 60 years, out of the hands of the family whose initials it carried. Because Peter Foden was nearly at the end of his stewardship. The world was consolidating. The economics of scale that favoured the giants were closing in on the independents, one by one, and ERF's board could read the arithmetic as well as anyone. Within 3 years of the EC's triumphant launch, the family would sell. And somewhere in the finance department, at a desk he'd occupied in one role or another since 1976, an unqualified accountant named Stephen Ellis was about to make a decision. Not a grand decision, not a boardroom decision. A small, quiet, catastrophic decision, taken alone, that would begin the ruin of everything 3 men and a boy had built. In March 1996, he falsified a VAT return. It was the first thread pulled. Nobody heard it go. Chapter 7. The books. To understand what Stephen Ellis did, you have to first understand who he was, because the temptation is to make him a villain and the truth will not allow it. He joined ERF in August 1976 and spent the next quarter of a century in its finance department, moving from role to role. He was not a qualified accountant. He had never sat the exams, never earned the letters after his name. What he knew about accountancy and bookkeeping he had learned on the job in the firm over years. A self-taught man who rose by application and loyalty until, by 1998, he was deputy to the financial controller, a man named Andrew Williamson, and later became the financial controller himself. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man ERF was full of. Someone who came in as a young man and gave the firm his working life. Someone the company trusted. And that trust is the whole tragedy, because it was never abused for the reasons trust is usually abused. Consider what the job of a financial controller actually is at a firm like ERF. He was the man who knew, before anyone else, whether the month had been good or bad. He saw the sales come in and the bills go out. He sat between the men on the erecting shop floor, who built lorries and trusted that a wage would follow, and the directors above, who needed the numbers to tell a story of a company worth backing. In a healthy firm, that is an honest position. In a firm quietly losing money, it becomes the loneliest desk in the building. Follow the sequence carefully, because the order of events matters more here than almost anywhere else in the story. The first falsified VAT return went in March 1996. That is before the family sold the firm. Then, from about the middle of 1997, the manipulation became systematic. The monthly management accounts and the year-end statutory accounts persistently, patiently altered. The techniques were not exotic. They were the small, grubby tools of a man making numbers say what they didn't mean. There were false journal entries, the accountant's most basic instrument, a line written into the ledger to move a figure from where it truly sat to where it needed to appear. There was early invoicing, raising invoices before the work was done or the goods dispatched, pulling next month's revenue into this month, so that a bad month wore the clothes of a good one. There was the concealment of trading losses, tucked into corners of the accounts the eye slid past, and there was the fraud on Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, systematic false claims for the repayment of VAT, money coming back from the government, into a company that needed cash the way a drowning man needs air. That last one is worth pausing on, because it reveals the desperate logic of the whole scheme. A VAT repayment is real cash. It arrives in the bank. So, while the manipulated accounts made ERF look profitable on paper, the false VAT claims actually kept the lights on, in fact. An injection of real money, obtained by fraud, plugging a real hole. Ellis was not merely making the company look alive. He was, by deception, keeping it alive, The scale of it, once totted up, was staggering for a firm this size. The 1998 audited accounts overstated ERF's assets by around £20.5 million. The 1999 accounts overstated them by about £35 million. Each year, the gap between the paper company and the real one grew wider, and each year Ellis had to work harder to bridge it, one false entry at a time. Now, the question the whole story turns on. Why? Not for himself. This is the finding that the court reached, and it is the finding that should govern how we think about Stephen Ellis for the rest of this documentary. There was nothing to suggest that Mr. Ellis, or anyone connected to him, benefited financially from what he did. He did not buy a house. He did not buy a boat. He did not skim a fortune into an account abroad. His motive, the court accepted, was to relieve the group's financial problems, to keep the money coming in from customs and excise, to make the accounts show a company that was surviving, because the real accounts showed a company that was not. He was cooking the books to save the firm, to keep the gates open, to protect the wage packets of the men he'd worked alongside for 20 years. Think about what that meant, day after day, year after year. A man arriving at his desk each morning knowing that the numbers he was about to write were false, carrying the true state of ERF, the losses, the mounting liabilities, alone in his own head, because to tell the truth was to end the company. He watched Andrew Williamson and the rest of the department work honestly around him, and he alone knew the ground they stood on wasn't there. Every falsified entry was a small act of loyalty that was also a crime, and the two could no longer be separated. His loyalty had curdled into fraud, and the fraud wore the face of loyalty, and somewhere in there, the man himself was lost. The company he was lying to protect appeared, on paper, modestly profitable, with net assets and a future. The company that actually existed was loss-making, its liabilities climbing, its survival now dependent, not on its lorries, but on a deception, and into that gap between the paper company and the real one, a buyer was about to walk. Twice. Chapter 8. The Nightmare Acquisition. The first buyer came from Canada. In 1996, the year Ellis falsified his first VAT return, the Foden family sold ERF. The buyer was Western Star. That name again. The badge ERF had worn in Australia decades before, now returned as an owner. The Canadian firm was run by a man called Terence Peabody, Terry to those who dealt with him, based in Kelowna, British Columbia, and co-owning the business with a partner named Bob Shand. ERF was Peabody's first venture into truck manufacturing. The reported price was around £27 million, roughly £2.75 a share. The logic was pooled buying power and Western Star's need for a cab-over-engine design that ERF could supply. On the 31st of December 1996, Peter Foden retired as chairman and chief executive, becoming honorary life president. And with that, quietly, on the last day of the year, the family that had built ERF let go of it after more than 6 decades. The gaffer, who knew the men by name, who drove his Bentley to customers for a cup of tea, stepped back. John Bryant, managing director since November 1991, stayed on and joined the Western Star board. Here is the thing that makes the Western Star years so bleak in hindsight. The fraud did not begin under German ownership, discovered by outsiders who never understood the firm. It deepened under Western Star. The persistent manipulation of the accounts, from the middle of 1997, happened on the Canadians' watch. ERF was already living the lie when Peabody owned it. The rot was inside the books when the family walked away, and it grew in the dark while the firm changed hands. Whatever Peter Foden's departure took from the company in knowledge and care, it did not take the thing that was killing it. That stayed at its desk. And then, at the turn of the new century, the second buyer came. From Germany this time, and far larger. MAN Nutzfahrzeug, the commercial vehicle arm of the great German engineering group, wanted a foothold in the British market. An ERF, with its loyal customers and its established dealer network, was the way in. The share purchase agreement was signed on the 30th of January 2000. The deal completed on the 8th of March 2000 for a price of £65.3 million, subject to adjustments. That figure matters because the story is often told with a bigger, wronger number. Contemporary press reported the price as around 100 million. It was not. The confusion comes from mixing two different things, the price MAN paid and the size of the hole it didn't know it was buying. The hole was around 100 million. The price was around 65. Keep them separate. because the gap between them is the whole disaster. Why did Western Star sell so soon after buying? The answer lies in the churn of the global industry that was, in these very years, swallowing the independents whole. Western Star itself was about to be taken over, absorbed by Freightliner, part of the Daimler-Chrysler empire, in July 2000. ERF was surplus to a firm being consumed by a bigger one, so it was sold on, and the accounts that Ellis had falsified were handed across the negotiating table to the Germans as if they were true. MAN did what any careful buyer does. It brought in advisors, Deloitte and Touche, to conduct due diligence, to examine the books before committing tens of millions of pounds. This is the ritual that is supposed to make such deals safe. A team of accountants goes in, pulls the ledgers apart, checks that the company being bought is the company being described. It is a defense against exactly the kind of thing that was happening at ERF. But due diligence has a flaw at its heart, and ERF exposed it perfectly. Due diligence examines the numbers it is given. It relies on the records the seller provides, and the records had been made false over years by a man who was still, at that very moment, employed by the company being sold. A man now presented to the buyers as the very person who understood ERF's finances best, because Stephen Ellis was identified as a key participant on accounting matters during the sale. He was in the meetings. He was the man MAN's people turned to when they wanted to understand a figure. And in those meetings, he made fraudulent misrepresentations to MAN's team about the state of ERF's finances. The same lie he'd told the ledgers for years, now told aloud, to faces, across a table. The negotiations were held away from ERF's own premises, in hotels, including the Cottons Hotel at Knatsford, deliberately to keep the sale secret from the workforce. So picture the scene. A quiet, unqualified accountant from Sandbach in a Cheshire hotel, sitting opposite the representatives of one of Germany's great industrial groups and the advisors from Deloitte and Touche. Papers on the table, coffee going cold, and Ellis telling them a company was sound when he alone in that room knew it was hollow. One has to believe he was still, even then, telling the lie he'd told himself for years, that this was to save ERF, that a big new owner with deep German pockets was exactly what the firm needed, that the deception would finally come true and be forgiven by events, that the buyer would pour in money, the losses would be covered, and the gap between the paper company and the real one would quietly close, and no one would ever have to know. And there was another failure layered underneath, one the courts would spend years untangling. ERF's auditors, Ernst and Young, had signed off the accounts. The UK firm, with a responsible partner named Alison Cunningham, later Mrs. Sinderson, had audited the 1998 and 1999 accounts and had not detected the fraud. There was a Canadian side too. Ernst and Young Canada audited Western Star's group accounts, with a partner named Edward Kendrick. Neither had found it. In the litigation that followed, Ernst and Young admitted that the UK statutory audits had been negligent, that with proper skill and care, the defects would have been found. So the layers stacked up, each one supposed to catch what the last one missed. The auditors were supposed to catch the false accounts, and didn't. The due diligence was supposed to catch what the auditors missed, and instead relied on the same tainted numbers and trusted the same man who'd made them. And the man himself continued making it all false, deceiving everyone at once, for more than a year after the Germans had signed. MAN believed it had bought a company with net assets of around £25 million. What it had actually bought was a company with net liabilities of around £75 million, a swing of roughly £100 million, and the man who had dug that hole had, the court would find, never taken a penny of it for himself. It could not stay hidden forever. Somebody, eventually, would open the wrong ledger. Chapter 9. Tip of the iceberg. It came apart in the spring and summer of 2001, the way these things always come apart, not with a dramatic confession, but with a reconciliation that wouldn't reconcile. In April 2001, a MAN internal auditor named Mr. Jung was looking into a discrepancy, ordinary work, a figure that didn't sit right. He pulled the purchase ledger, the record of what the company owed its suppliers, and found it in disarray. Numbers that should have matched did not match, and the deeper he looked, the worse it got. What should have been an afternoon's reconciliation opened into something without a bottom. Then a woman named Mrs. Frobisher, preparing the quarterly accounts to the 30th of June 2001, found discrepancies she could not explain. She was doing her job properly, and her job, done properly, kept turning up things that should not have been there. This is how a long fraud usually ends, not because an investigator storms in, but because honest people doing careful work keep finding the edges of it. On the 18th of July 2001, a manager named Mr. Wagner sent a warning up the line to Mann's internal audit. The problems found so far, he said, were only the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg. He was right, and the phrase has the terrible economy of a man who has just glimpsed the size of something and knows he cannot yet see all of it. On the 23rd of July 2001, Stephen Ellis was suspended. Shortly after, so were the senior managers John Bryant and Mr. Wagner himself. 25 years after he'd joined ERF as a young man, it was over for Ellis in a single day. He walked out of the finance department he'd occupied since 1976, and the secret he'd carried alone walked out with him. And now, for the first time, other people had to learn to carry it too. And now the true shape of the thing surfaced. The accounts had shown net assets of around £25 million. The reality was net liabilities of around £75 million. The intercompany account, the money ERF owed within the group, had swollen from around £37.5 million to just under £135 million by June 2001, as the loss-making truth of the company drained cash it did not have. £100 million hole in a firm that built lorries in Cheshire. What followed was not fury. This is where the easy version of the story gets it wrong. Mann did not lash out in a rage and smash the firm to pieces out of wounded pride. What Mann did was colder than that, and in its way, sadder. It did the rational thing. It went to law to get its money back, and it restructured the company to stop the bleeding. The chairman of MAN's commercial vehicle arm, Håkan Samuelsson, described what they'd found with a plainness that needs no embellishment: a big hole in the balance sheet. In October 2001, Mann split ERF in two, a manufacturing unit at Middlewich under a manager named Arne Lutgen, a separate business unit under David Smith and Dr. Jürgen Knorp. And the workforce was cut from around 770 people to around 400. The first great wave of redundancies, more than 300 jobs, fell not because ERF built bad lorries, but because a man in the finance department had, out of loyalty, told a lie too big for the firm to survive its telling. The men who lost their jobs that autumn had never seen the ledgers. They built cabs and fitted engines and packed parts, and they were the first to pay for a fraud committed to protect them. Then came the law, and the numbers turned astronomical. The case was Mann Nutsfahrzeug against Freightliner Limited, Freightliner being the successor to Western Star, the Canadian vendor, after the Daimler Chrysler takeover. It was tried before Lord Justice Moore Bick, sitting as a commercial court judge, over the first half of 2005. It was one of the great commercial trials of its day, and the men arguing it were among the finest advocates in the country. Dominic Kendrick QC led for MAN, instructed by the solicitors Slaughter and May. Geoffrey Voss QC led for Freightliner, instructed by Clifford Chance. Justin Fenwick QC appeared for Ernst & Young, instructed by Linklaters. The full weight of the London commercial bar gathered to argue over what a self-taught accountant in Sandbach had done to a set of books. Mann's claim ran to around £350 million. In October 2005, Moorbick gave his ruling on liability. Freightliner was held liable in deceit. The reasoning was precise and, once you see it, almost cruel in its logic. Because Western Star had put Stephen Ellis forward to speak on its behalf about ERF's accounts during the sale, it was vicariously responsible for his fraudulent misrepresentations to MAN. The vendor had chosen the man. The vendor had vouched for him, placed him in the room, presented him as the person who could answer for the numbers. And so, the vendor, or rather its successor, Freightliner, carried the cost of the lie he told. Freightliner tried, in turn, to pass the loss to the auditors. It brought claims against Ernst & Young, arguing that the negligent audits were the real cause of everything. Those claims failed. The courts held that Mann's loss was the direct result of Ellis's dishonesty, not the inaccuracy of the accounts as such, and that the auditors, on the principles the law applies to such things, had assumed no special duty that would make them liable for this particular loss. The Court of Appeal, in September 2007, with Lord Justice Chadwick among the judges, upheld that finding, and so the strange verdict stood. The auditors had been negligent. They admitted it in open court, and yet they walked away without paying man a penny. In December 2005, the court made an interim damages award of £250 million, believed to be the largest order of its kind ever made, and at the end of May 2007, it was settled. Freightliner agreed to pay Amman an indemnity of £250 million, around €370 million, ending the parallel actions running in both Britain and the United States. Mann said the settlement spared it years of costly litigation in the higher courts, £250 million, changing hands between a German giant and a Canadian-American conglomerate in settlement of a lie told by a man who never took anything for himself, to save a company that no longer existed in the form he'd been trying to save, because by the time the lawyers finished, the lorries had already stopped. For the men who were left to build the last of them, the ending had a strange, drawn-out quality. British manufacture didn't stop with a hooter and a handshake on a single afternoon. It wound down, model by model, line by line, as the work drained away to Munich and Nuremberg and Steyr. A fitter, who had built ERFs for 20 years, found himself building fewer, then fewer still, and knowing, because everyone knew by then, that the machine he was working on might be among the last to wear the name in the country that invented it. There is a particular dignity in that, and a particular cruelty. You do the job properly to the end, because that is what you have always done, and because a lorry doesn't care about the fate of the firm that builds it. It only cares that the man building it knew what he was doing. And the men at Middlewich knew what they were doing, right up to the moment there was nothing left to do. British manufacturing of ERF trucks ended in March 2002. Around another 200 jobs went then, on top of the 300 and more the previous autumn, roughly 500 people in all, over 18 months, in the towns of Sandbach and Middlewich, where making lorries had been the shape of life for the better part of a century. Production moved abroad, the heavy models to Munich and Nuremberg, the lighter ones to Austria, to Steyr, built on the same lines as their identical MAN cousins, and the very last EC Series ERF built in Britain, an EC11 called the Olympic, went to a family haulier in Norfolk, Jack Richards and Son. Somewhere in its build, hands that had assembled these lorries for a working lifetime fitted its panels and torqued its wheels and signed it off, the way they'd signed off thousands before it, except that this time there would be no next one on Monday. A family firm's lorry, the last of its line, delivered to a family firm. There is a small mercy in that, if you look for it. The gleaming factory at Middlewich, the one built at the turn of the century, barely 2 years old, the one insiders had always suspected was really a warehouse dressed up as a plant, fell quiet. The ring of spanners, the hiss of air tools, the resinous smell of the SP panels curing under heat, all of it stopped, and the silence that came into that building was the silence of a place designed for noise and no longer permitted to make it. Chapter 10. The name on the grille. The brand did not die at once. That is the last correction the honest version of this story requires, because the temptation is to say, man killed ERF in a rage in 2002, and it isn't true. What man did was keep the name alive on lorries that were really man's. For a few more years, you could buy an ERF badged truck, and it would be a man underneath, built in Germany or Austria, wearing the old Cheshire name on its grille. There was one thing that still made it genuinely an ERF, one real difference under the skin: the option of a Cummins engine, the ISME, a nod to the decades when ERF's whole identity was built on choosing the best bought-in engine it could find. It was fitting in a way that the last true trace of ERF was an engine choice. That had always been the essence of the firm. Choice, the best of what the world made, bolted together with care. That single option was the last living thread connecting the badge to what the badge had meant. And then the thread was cut, not by malice, but by regulation. New European emissions rules, Euro 4, were coming, and to keep selling the Cummins ISME, someone had to build a version that met them. Cummins decided the market didn't justify it and declined. Without a Euro 4 compliant ISME, the last real difference between an ERF and the MAN, it was based on, simply vanished. There was no longer any reason for the ERF badge to exist, because there was nothing under it that a MAN didn't already offer. The very vulnerability the firm had discovered in the war that a company which doesn't make its own engine can be stopped when the engine stops, returned 60 years later to deliver the final blow. The sales told the story with brutal clarity. By the middle of 2007, ERF registrations had fallen to 81 units, down 46% from 150 at the same point the year before. A firm that had once taken a full tenth of the heavy market was now selling lorries in double figures. In July 2007, MAN ended ERF production. MAN ERF UK Limited was renamed MAN Truck and Bus UK Limited, and with the stroke that changed a company's name on a registration document, the three letters that Edwin Richard Foden's colleagues had stamped on a radiator in 1933, his own initials, the bones of his own name, were gone from British lorries. 74 years after Chassis 63. The chief executive, Des Evans, explained it without cruelty and without sentiment. While there was a sustainable market demand for the ERF brand, he said they would continue to build and supply the lorries. But that demand had shrunk to almost nothing, and it was no longer economically viable to manufacture and market the brand. It was true. It was also the sound of a door closing on 74 years. There is a question that hangs over all of this, and honesty requires admitting it cannot be fully answered. What happened to Stephen Ellis? He was dismissed when the fraud was uncovered in 2001. Beyond that, no record has been found of any criminal prosecution for the VAT fraud or the false accounting, and no record of any disqualification. As an employee rather than a statutory director, he may have fallen outside the reach of the law that bars disgraced directors from running companies. But the absence of a record is not proof of anything. It means only that the trail, in the public sources, goes cold. A man carried £100 million secret for years, lost everything when it broke, and then, as far as the record shows, simply disappeared from the story he had unwittingly ended. Walk through Sandbach today, and you will find no trace of ERF. The Sunworks is gone. There is no trace of Foden either. The family mansion at Westfields was demolished. The works long vanished. The gleaming Middlewich factory on ERF Way, the one that was always half a warehouse, became a Wincanton distribution centre, lorries passing through it that no one in Cheshire had built. The older service centre, the one engineered against the brine subsidence, is gone too. A town that made lorries at both ends of its high street now makes none. What survives is quieter and more human. Foden's brass band still plays in Sandbach, a band that outlived the firm that named it. And ERF Historic Vehicles Limited, founded in 1988, keeps the heritage fleet alive with something like 650 members, preserving the old lorries and, at the heart of the collection, Chassis 63 itself. ERF number 1, the lorry. 3 men and a boy built by lamplight, still cared for, decades after the company that descended from it ceased to exist. ERF was not alone in its ending, and that is worth saying because it places the tragedy in its true frame. This was the last act of an entire vanished industry. Foden, the crosstown cousin, was bought by the American giant PACCAR in 1980, and the last Foden was built in July 2006, 150 years, almost to the year, after the family firm had begun with steam. Leyland and Daff passed to PACCAR as well. Seddon Atkinson, the very firm that had beaten ERF to the Atkinson name back in 1970, passed to International Harvester, then to Spain, then to Iveco. Bedford simply died. The causes were the same in every case. Small scale. Too little capital. The thin margins of the assembler, buying its engines and axles from others and living on the difference. And European rivals with better cabs, deeper pockets, and economies of scale a Cheshire firm of a few hundred people could never hope to match. ERF's particular ending, the fraud, the litigation, the £100 million hole, was unique, but the underlying current that pulled it down had already pulled down every one of its neighbours, one by one, over 30 years. Ellis's lie didn't create the danger. It only changed the manner of the drowning. There is one more thing, and it should be said carefully, because it is easy to reach for and easy to misuse. The buyer, MAN, was itself no paragon. In the years spanning roughly 2001 to 2007, the very years it owned ERF and pursued Freightliner through the courts over a fraud, MAN was later found to have been running its own vast bribery scandal, spanning more than 20 countries. It is not a point to dwell on with satisfaction. It is simply a fact that sits alongside the others, a quiet irony at the edge of the story. The giant that inherited a small firm's lie was all the while carrying enormous secrets of its own. Chapter 11. What Remains. At a vehicle rally on a summer weekend, somewhere in the north of England, you can still hear it. The burble of an old Gardner diesel, deep and unhurried, the sound of British haulage as it was for half a century. A preserved KV with its curved windscreen catching the light, or an EC in the faded livery of some long-gone haulier, polished on a Saturday by a man who spends his weekends keeping alive a machine his father might have driven up the M6 in the rain. That is what remains of ERF. Not a factory, not a brand on a grill, a brass band that plays on, a preservation society 650 strong, and a fleet of old lorries kept running by people who simply refused to let the memory go silent. And chassis 63, of course, still here. Older now than Edwin Richard Foden ever was, still carrying the number that was once a man's age, built in a conservatory at the bottom of the Depression, by 3 men and a boy the neighbours had laughed at. The deepest sorrow of the ERF story is not the German buyer, or the litigation, or even the 500 people who lost their livelihoods in Sandbach and Middlewich. It is quieter than any of those, and it lives in the character of Stephen Ellis. Because the fraud that destroyed ERF was in his own account, the account a High Court judge examined and accepted, an attempt to save it. He lied to keep the gates open. He falsified the books to protect the wages of the men he'd worked beside for a quarter of a century. He wanted more than anything a man can want at a desk for the firm to survive. And it was the telling of the truth that finished it. The moment the lie was uncovered was the moment the company began, in earnest, to die. Had he never told it, ERF might well have collapsed years earlier. Honestly, quietly, another small British maker sunk by scale and thin margins, mourned and then forgotten. Because he told it, ERF survived a few years longer on borrowed reality, and then died all at once, in litigation and redundancy and the slow erasure of its name, in a way that scarred everyone it touched and enriched no one but the lawyers. A firm kept alive by a lie told to save it. A truth that, once spoken, killed the very thing the lie had tried to protect. Sandbach makes no lorries now. 2 works stood at either end of that town, built by 2 branches of one family, and for the better part of a century they were the reason the place existed. The hooter is silent. The erecting shops are gone, or given over to other work, or replaced by racking where distribution lorries idle. And on the M6 that runs past the town, the traffic still thunders north and south, day and night, carrying the goods of a nation, every lorry on it built somewhere else. But if you know what you're listening for, and the wind is right, and an old ERF happens to be idling in a rally field a few miles off, you can still catch it. That deep, patient, unhurried burble, the sound of the best of British made by a few hundred people in a Cheshire town, who chose the finest of everything the world could offer and bolted it together with more care than anyone thought a firm that small could manage. 3 men and a boy. What can they do? The neighbours had asked. For 70 years the answer was, rather a lot.